243,000 kilometers of ocean coastline wrap around one country, enough shoreline to circle Earth roughly 6 times, containing ancient rock, enormous freshwater systems, 4-story tides, and territory extending so far north that islands disappear beneath ice caps. Yet 90% of Canadians live in a ribbon barely 160 kilometers from the US border. By fact 1, you'll understand why. Canada is the second largest country on Earth and touches the Pacific, Atlantic, and Arctic Oceans simultaneously. Most of its vast area is water, islands, rock, forest, and tundra, not heavily settled land. But those 3 ocean connections give Canada something most countries lack: sovereign maritime claims across 3 separate ocean systems, with exclusive economic zones that extend hundreds of kilometers offshore in 3 directions. The ocean territory alone makes Canada one of the most geographically powerful countries on Earth, before the land is even considered. Canada's coastline exceeds 243,000 kilometers along 3 oceans. Stretch that into a straight line, and you could wrap it around Earth's equator about 6 times, nearly double Norway's famously fractured coastline. That length comes from the same fractal complexity that makes Greenland's coast unmappable. Every fjord, inlet, and island counted. But 243,000 kilometers of coastline also means 243,000 kilometers to monitor, patrol, and manage. Canada has one of the lowest ratios of Coast Guard coverage to coastline length in the developed world. The country has more shoreline than it can effectively watch. Between Ontario and the United States sits a freshwater system stretching more than 1,200 kilometers east to west. The Great Lakes contain roughly 18% of Earth's surface freshwater. That means what happens to the water here can matter far beyond either country sharing it. At Thawing in Yukon, 5,959-meter Mount Logan rises higher than anything else in Canada. The stranger part, the same region contains 17 of the country's 20 tallest mountains. One corner of Canada essentially hoards almost the entire national leaderboard. That concentration of altitude isn't just a ranking anomaly. The St. Elias mountain cluster creates the largest non-polar ice fields in the world outside of Greenland and Antarctica, a permanent ice mass produced by the same topographic compression that built Canada's tallest peaks. The mountains don't just dominate the height chart, they generate their own frozen sea. Farther north, huge sections of Canadian ground remain frozen for at least 2 consecutive years. Permafrost. Roads and buildings aren't simply sitting on dirt there. In many places, they depend on frozen ground remaining frozen. Permafrost underlies roughly half of Canada's land area, including the routes of the northern roads, pipelines, and airstrips that are the only connection some communities have to the rest of the country. And that connects to something about Canada's enormous north. I will show you in a moment. But first, the frozen north isn't just a challenge for construction. It's part of why the human population is where it is, and isn't. That distribution is coming in the top 3. At the Bay of Fundy, seawater rises by as much as 16 meters, roughly the height of a 4-story building. Walk across exposed seafloor at low tide, and about 6 hours later, that same ground is beneath enough water to kayak over it. The coastline transforms twice every day, and the volume of water making that transformation is not a small coastal pulse. The daily flow of ocean water through the Bay of Fundy exceeds the combined flow of every river on Earth. Twice a day, every day, the bay moves more water than the Amazon, the Congo, and the Mississippi combined, making it one of the most powerful natural water movement systems on the planet. Deep inside Nahanni National Park, Nilicho, Virginia Falls, sends the South Nahanni River over a drop twice the height of Niagara Falls. Yet unlike Niagara, no major city surrounds it. Beyond the falls, enormous wilderness, canyon walls, and mountains stretching far beyond the horizon. Virginia Falls is accessible only by float plane or a multi-day river journey. It receives a fraction of Niagara's annual visitors, despite being twice as dramatic. A direct result of the geography the rest of this video is about. Canada has a waterfall that would be one of the world's most famous landmarks, if the population were anywhere near it. That frozen northern ground from number 21 is not just empty space on a map. Permafrost can contain so much ice that when it thaws, the ground itself begins to collapse. Roads can buckle, Foundations can shift. Entire landscapes can sink. Northern infrastructure can literally depend on the ground staying frozen. Along the Acosta River in the Northwest Territories sits Acosta gneiss, more than 4 billion years old, rock that formed when Earth itself was still incredibly young. You can stand in Canada and touch material nearly as old as the planet beneath your feet. The Acosta gneiss is also a scientific reference point. Zircon crystals embedded in it are among the primary sources geologists use to study how Earth's earliest continental crust formed. Canada's oldest rock isn't just a record of age, it's one of the main tools scientists use to understand how the continents themselves came to exist. Canada contains about 20% of the world's freshwater and roughly 25% of its wetlands. On paper, that sounds like an almost impossible abundance of water. But possessing enormous freshwater reserves does not mean every community has equal access to clean, usable water. Abundance and accessibility are two completely different geographic problems. Look north and Canada's map suddenly becomes geopolitical. The Northwest Passage threads through the Canadian Arctic, creating a possible marine route between the Atlantic and Pacific. Canada considers much of the passage part of its internal waters. The United States has historically viewed key sections differently. Hold on to that, because what I am about to show you at number 3 is the only thing that makes this scale make sense. Inside Wood Buffalo National Park lies the largest known beaver dam on Earth, expanded by generations of beavers until it became large enough to detect in satellite imagery. In Canada, even the wildlife can reshape the map. But the dam isn't just a size record. The wetland system it created altered the local hydrology permanently, producing a distinct ecosystem of bird and fish species that now depend on the water levels the beavers maintain. No human designed it, no government funded it, and no engineering team maintains it. It's been self-sustaining for decades, building itself into an ecosystem that didn't exist before it was built. Canada's Arctic contains ice caps so large that on parts of the Queen Elizabeth Islands, they cover roughly 1/4 of the land. What appears on a political map as solid Canadian territory is physically hundreds of kilometers of mountains, glaciers, and ice. In Kootenay-Pock National Park on Ellesmere Island, some ice caps reach nearly 900 meters thick, almost a vertical kilometer of solid ice pressing down on the landscape below. Imagine stacking several skyscrapers on top of each other and replacing every floor with ice. These caps are monitored continuously because when they melt and reach the ocean, they contribute to global sea level rise. Canada's most remote political territory is also one of its most consequential geographic features for everywhere else on Earth. The Great Lakes cover more than 244,000 square kilometers, comparable to the size of the United Kingdom. And yet these enormous lakes represent only one piece of Canada's freshwater geography. Across the country, water repeatedly interrupts what looks on a normal map like solid land. The Great Lakes Basin is also one of the most economically significant geographic zones in North America. The surrounding region accounts for roughly 30% of Canada's GDP and about 8% of the United States. The largest freshwater system in the world isn't just a physical feature, it's an economic foundation. Canada shares an 8,891-kilometer land boundary with the United States. It is the longest international land border on Earth. That boundary doesn't simply separate two countries. It connects cities, roads, railways, factories, farms, and supply chains across nearly an entire continent. Huge distances separate communities. Harsh weather raises costs. Mountains, lakes, forests, and frozen terrain complicate construction. And despite Canada's enormous outline, the population is concentrated far more tightly than the map suggests. That compression has created one of the most unusual transportation geographies in the developed world. A country larger than the contiguous United States that has fewer kilometers of highway than France. The land is vast, the infrastructure is thin, and what fills the gap, air routes, remote roads, seasonal ice roads, costs more per kilometer than almost anywhere on Earth. Thawing National Park alone covers nearly 22,000 square kilometers of mountains, valleys, and glaciers, larger than some entire countries. Mount Logan is so remote that most visitors never see Canada's tallest mountain from the roads people normally travel. The highest point in the country is hidden deep inside wilderness. Thawing is also the core of a trans-boundary wilderness complex connecting to Alaska's Wrangell St. Elias and BC's Taitchinshini-Alsek. Together they form the largest protected wilderness area in the world, larger than the entire country of Italy. Canada's remoteness isn't a limitation. In this case, it produced one of the largest intact wild systems still functioning on Earth. The Canadian Arctic is not just frozen land. Massive ice caps on Baffin Island and the Queen Elizabeth Islands store enormous amounts of water above sea level. When land ice melts and reaches the ocean, it contributes to global sea level rise. So changes occurring in one of Canada's most remote regions can eventually connect to coastal cities thousands of kilometers away. Canada's most remote geography affects coastlines everywhere else. And the most surprising thing about Canada's geography concerns where Canadians themselves actually live. Canada contains a belt stretching across the country like a living wall between the more heavily populated south and Arctic landscapes farther north. On a satellite image, it becomes one of the defining geographic features of the entire continent. The Boreal is also the world's largest terrestrial carbon sink. Canada's portion alone stores more carbon than most countries release in decades, making it one of the most consequential climate systems on Earth. What happens to Canada's boreal forest doesn't stay in Canada. Which means Canada's giant empty-looking spaces are not simply unused land. They contain forests, wetlands, exposed Canadian shield, tundra, lakes, glaciers, mountains, and enormous ecosystems. The political map makes these regions look blank. The physical map reveals that they are packed with geography, just not with people. Canada's northern geography places it directly beside the Arctic Ocean, while giving it an enormous northern coastline and marine territory. The same enormous north that makes transportation, construction, and settlement difficult is precisely what gives Canada extraordinary geographic reach. The land that seems least useful for population is some of the territory that matters most strategically. The north gives Canada strategic reach that most countries can't match, and almost nobody lives there. That gap between the political map and the human map is what Fact 2 and Fact 1 are about. Draw Canada's population instead of its borders, and the country changes shape completely. Statistics Canada found that roughly 2/3 of Canadians lived within just 100 kilometers of the southern United States border in 2016. That population occupied land representing only about 4% of Canada's territory. So the enormous Canadian map you recognize is almost nothing like the map of where Canadians actually live. Zoom out slightly farther and the illusion completely breaks. Roughly 90% of Canada's population has been described as living within about 160 kilometers, around 100 miles, of the United States border. Meanwhile, an enormous portion of the country's northern territory contains only a tiny fraction of its people. So one of Earth's largest countries doesn't function like a giant evenly populated block. Its ancient shield, frozen north, immense forests, mountains, waterways, climate, farmland, transportation routes, and access to the United States have helped compress modern Canada into an incredibly long southern corridor. Now you understand why one of the biggest countries on Earth functions like a thin strip pressed against another country. And Canada's geography is the reason that's true. If you thought Canada was geographically extreme, wait until you see how our next country influences the world we all live in. Which fact did you find most interesting? Drop it in the comments, and if you want to see more, subscribe.